Robots are now everywhere. Yeah? They're running our logistics. Some of them also already dance better than the average English person. And sometimes robots also make mistakes. So the question that I'm going to ask here today is, how do we judge robots when they're making these mistakes? We're entering a world in which there are going to be robot companions everywhere, and we need to understand, when we interact with them, if we're judging them in a way that is fair or if we're being too hard with them. How do we incorporate them into society depends on the way that we treat robots in the future. Do we even know if we're doing that properly? So the title of this talk is How Humans Judge Machines. And it's based on a series of experiments that I've been running over the last few years. So we all know that AI ethics now is a hot topic. There's a lot of literature that is being produced in the academic press and in the popular press about the ethics of AI. But this literature can be divided into a few groups. On the one hand, there's people that are asking the question, well, how should machines behave? Okay? So they're asking the question about the internal state of machine. How should we program those machines to be ethical? What should the self-driving car do? Should it go left? Should it go right? When it's in an uncertain situation. There's other people that are asking a different question, which is, well, are machines treating us fairly? When people are using algorithms in human resources, or they're using algorithms to determine admission of people into universities, are those algorithms fair? Or are they encoding biases that we already have? But if we're passing all of that judgment on those machines, if we're judging how should they behave or whether they're fair to us, it is reasonable that we should also think about how we judge them. So the question that I'm going to explore here is, how do we actually judge the machines? When we're making these judgments about their behavior, or we're trying to impose behavior on them, are we doing it in a way that is also fair? So we did more than 80 scenarios, which allowed us to experimentally understand how people judge machines compared to humans that are making the same mistake. The scenarios go something like this. In a subway station, an officer sees a person carrying a suspicious package. Other people would see in a subway station, a computer vision system sees a person carrying a suspicious package. So the scenario is the same, but we only change the subject that is performing the action. In some cases, it's a human, some cases, it's a machine, and a different group of around 200 people sees each one of these scenarios. Then, when we look at those scenarios, we ask questions. Was the action harmful, intentional? Was it morally wrong? So in this case, there's a subway station, and there's an officer or a computer vision system that sees a person that matches the description of a terrorist and that is carrying a package. This officer or computer vision system detains the person, asks the person to stop. The person doesn't understand English, reaches into their pocket to get identification. The police officer or the robot gets nervous in some way, they feel threatened, and then unloads the weapon on the person. An investigation later reveals that this person was not a terrorist, but a businessman on the way to the airport. So this is clearly a mistake. But in one case, the mistake was made by a human, and in the other case, the mistake was made by a machine. How do people judge those mistakes? What we're going to do here is we're going to show a bunch of examples, and they're going to be based on looking at how people respond to these different questions when they're phrased in the context of being the action of a human or the action of a machine. So you're going to be seeing a lot of these charts in which you have the average response that people have to these questions. So for example, here in the question of harm, which is the one that is on the top of the chart, you see that people see this action as a little bit more hurtful when it's performed by a machine than when it's performed by a human. When you ask people, would you hire this officer or would you hire this computer vision system, they're less likely to want to hire this computer vision system than to hire the officer again. Was the action intentional? They put more or less the same amount of intention in both. Do you like the police officer? Well, they like the police officer more than the machine, even though they both made the same mistake. The other thing that we're going to do in each one of these scenarios is we're going to look at the moral dimensions that they involve. So we pass on judgment on many things, but the judgment that we pass is split into 5 or 6 moral dimensions, which are used by moral psychologists to understand the different ways in which we judge the world. There are some moral dilemmas that involve harm. Someone is being physically hurt, like in the case of the scenario that I presented before. But there are type of moral problems. For instance, sometimes there are situations that are unfair. Sometimes people are being not loyal, or sometimes there are breaches of authority. There's even a moral dimension associated with purity, which can go to things like religion or even the purity of the human body. In the case of the previous example, we see here a radial chart that tells us that this moral dilemma is a moral dilemma about harm and fairness. A person was hurt physically in a way that was unfair. So that's sort of the dimension that would define this moral problem. So now let's go to the real examples. So the real examples comes in groups, because these groups help us see things, by comparing the answers that people give to different variations of the same scenario. So this is a harm scenario in which a large tsunami is approaching a coastal town of 10,000 people. The tsunami has potentially devastating consequences, so the politician or algorithm that is responsible for the safety of the town can decide to evacuate everyone with a 50% chance of success, or save 50% of the town with 100% success. So there are 3 options. One option is to take the risk, try to save everyone. But since that option is risky, you might take the risk and you might fail. So in this version of the scenario, the politician or algorithm decides to save everyone, but the rescue effort fails. The town is devastated and a large number of people die. The next option is success. You took the risk, you tried to save everyone, and you got lucky, everybody was saved. The last option is to take a compromise. So you don't try to save everyone, you just try to save 50% of the people with a sure probability. So how do people react to these 3 different scenarios? So we ask them also a variety of questions, and what we find interesting is in the case of success or in the case of compromise, people don't judge machines and humans that differently. But in the case that you have a risk that fails, people judge machines much more harshly than they judge other humans taking the same risk. For example, when we look at the failure situation, when it comes to harm, people see the action of the machine as more harmful than the same action performed by a human. When it comes to would you hire this politician or would you hire this algorithm? Well, people would be likely to rehire this politician that made that risky decision, but they would not hire the machine that took that risk and failed. When it comes to intention, they see the action of the human as more intentional, especially when the action was a success. When you ask, do they like the machine or do they like the politician? When there's a failure, they like the machine way less than the politician. When you ask them how morally wrong is, they see the action of the machine as much more morally wrong. And when you ask if this machine or this politician should be promoted, they're less likely to promote the machine. So in this case, you do see clear differences between the way that people judge humans and the way in which people judge machines that express themselves in the case that there's a risk and there's failure, but not so much in the case that you take a compromise or you take a risk and succeed. Why is that? Maybe that's one of the questions that you may want to ask. So this is a tree of a scenario that involves the purity dimension. So these are 3 examples of controversial ads, some of which are real, some of which are not. The first one says a well-known clothing company wants to create a high-impact commercial. It decides to hire a new marketeer or an AI marketing system to design an image that combines rivalry and love. The results are the images below, which cause shock and outrage among members of the public. In the next example, there's a public transportation company. They want to do an ad that combines the idea of riding. They come up with that ad. It's clearly not the right message. In the last example, you have a clothing company that wants to create an advertisement that illustrates the idea of addiction to clothes and clearly shows an image, that some people might have a reaction against. So nobody's getting hurt in these cases, but the people are violating what would be called a purity dimension, okay? These are actions, that in some way they seem impure to us. So we ask again, people how they judge these actions when the marketing decisions were done by machines and when they were done by humans. But here we did a little twist. We also asked two different questions, which are questions about the responsibility for these mistakes. So who's responsible for this mistake? Is it the marketeer, or is it the organization that hired the marketing company or the marketing algorithm? Who should respond to the public? When you make a mistake like this, someone is going to have to respond to the public. And we see that responsibility shifts up, when you have an algorithm. So what this is telling us is that in a future in which AI may become commonplace, we may have an important side effect on the adoption of AI in organizations, which is that AI is going to centralize a lot of responsibility. And this is interesting because one of the reasons why people delegate things to others is not only to try to distribute the knowledge that you need to do things, but it's also because you want to shield yourself from the responsibility of the mistakes. So in a world in which automation becomes more common, responsibility is going to become centralized. And that's our second lesson. Our third group of dilemmas involve self-driving car dilemmas. These are dilemmas in which there was an accident that was caused by some sort of exogenous reason. So in the first example, we're in a sunny spring day, and a driver or a driverless car that is working for a supermarket chain accidentally runs over a pedestrian who runs in front of the vehicle. The next example is the same, but using a dog instead of a pedestrian, so we can lower the moral status of the victim of the scenario. The next couple of scenarios involve a cold, windy day in which a driver or driverless car, also working for a supermarket chain, swerves to avoid a falling tree. By swerving, the driver or driverless car loses control of the vehicle, leading to an accident that seriously injures a pedestrian on the sidewalk. So this, once again, is a dilemma involving the dimension of harm. But it's a dilemma involving the dimension of harm in which the harm is caused by some sort of exogenous reason. Either the victim jumps in front of the car, or there is a falling tree that causes the car to make a difficult decision in a short period of time. And what we find here is interesting. On the one hand, we recover the fact that we found in the first trio of examples. The action is seen as more harmful when it's done by a machine than when it's done by a human. Even though, of course, that is technically the same. But the action is also seen more intentional when it's done by a machine. And that's interesting because we logically know that machines have no intention. But this high level of intentionality of the machine, is not because we assign a lot of intention to the machine, it's because we're assigning very little intention to the human driver. So what this is telling us that maybe we excuse humans more, when there are exogenous reasons of an accident than what we excuse machines. We also find that people like the machine less, they find their action to be more morally wrong, and they're less likely to promote or continue to engage with the driverless car. The fourth and final set of examples involve another dimension, which is that of loyalty. Loyalty is expressed between people, but also between groups. Like being a traitor is a moral judgment that is not about hurting someone, but it's about betraying the loyalty that a group might have given you and that group expects back. So this moral dilemma, which we borrow from Jonathan Haidt's work, goes in the following way. A family has a cleaner or robot in charge of cleaning their house. One day, the family finds the cleaner or robot use an old national flag to clean the bathroom floor and then threw it away. Yeah? So clearly, nobody gets hurt when someone cleans a bathroom with an American flag. But, you are betraying the loyalty that that national symbol maybe deserves. So we use variations of this topic, other dilemmas that also involve a betrayal or treason. A demolition crew composed of construction workers and heavy machinery, or autonomous heavy machinery, has to demolish a school. The school has a flag, they don't see the flag gets destroyed and torn down together with the school. In a major sporting event, the operator or algorithm running the public announcement system interrupts the national anthem to notify about a car that is poorly parked. In an international sporting event, the operator or algorithm running the public announcement system plays the wrong national anthem for one of the two teams. The fans of the station in the stadium are baffled and annoyed. So how do people judge machines and humans in this case? Here we have a dilemma in which the machine or the human was unloyal, in some way disrespected a national emblem. And what we find is an interesting seesaw type of effect. In the case of the school demolition, this is seen as completely unintentional. In this case of the wrong anthem, it's also seen as quite unintentional. But in the case of the anthem interruption and in the case of the robot cleaner, people attribute a lot of intention to the human and very little intention to the machine. And in this case, especially in the case of the robot cleaner, they see the human as having done something more morally wrong than the machine. So in the previous examples, machines were judged more harshly. But in this example, we have the opposite. We have an example in which now a machine is being unloyal or a human is being unloyal. And in this moral dimension, when intention is assigned, basically machines get a break and humans are judged more harshly. So you've seen about 14 scenarios, and we have more than 80. Of course, I cannot show all of them. We have scenarios involving very different type of moral problems. Scenarios including algorithmic bias, scenarios involving labor displacement, scenarios involving privacy. But at the end of the day, we cannot understand the world by looking at scenarios as simple examples. So I want to ask the question, well, are there patterns that emerge across these scenarios that could help us develop an effective theory of machine behavior or AI ethics? So what we're going to do now is we're going to abstract. Instead of looking at a scenario in detail, we're going to look at a few dimensions of them. So we're going to take each scenario, and we're going to see how they are judged in the case of a human action or a machine action using three basic dimensions of morality. How much harm people attribute to that action, how much intention they attribute to it, and how wrong they think this action is. And since each scenario is evaluated in the condition in which a human or a machine performed the action, these judgments are a dyad in this space that are connected by a little line. Red is always for machines, and blue is for humans. So we get this moral space. So here we have our more than 80 scenarios. And the first thing that we see is that the scenarios are not all over the place. They kind of like define some sort of band or space in which they occur. Yeah? So let's look at that space in more detail. First, let's look at the top, in which we have the harm and intention plane. And what we see is a very clear separation. When we look at scenarios in which a lot of intention is involved, people assign much more intention to the humans than to the machines. The blue dots are on top of the red dots. But when we have scenarios that involve little intention, scenarios that are accidental, like the ones on the bottom, people assign more intention to the machine than to the human. So in the way that we judge humans, we assign either a lot of intention or little intention. Either, you are to blame for something, or you are completely excused. But in the case of machine, that distribution is not bimodal. It's more unimodal. It's more centered around an intermediate level of intention. You never get excused too much, but also you never get attributed too much intention if you're a machine. The next plane is the intention wrongness plane. Okay? So we know for a long time that as intention goes up, we enhance moral judgments. You cannot do something really bad if you didn't have intention, but also you cannot do something really good if you didn't have intention. And what we find is three regimes. First, when intention is low, we find that the actions of machines, they seem to be worse than the actions of humans. People judge them as being more wrong. But when intention goes up, we see a different type of a scenario. On the top, when the actions are very wrong, people attribute more intention to human actions, and they also see them as worse. But when the actions are positive, like in the bottom of the chart, when wrongness is low, that means a positive action, then people also attribute more intention to the human action, and they also see them as better. So when a machine performs an action that is positive, it's going to get less credit than a human performing the same positive action. Many of these examples in those two extremes involve examples of algorithmic bias that is either created by a human or a machine or corrected by a human or a machine. This is telling you that when that bias is created by a human is judged more harshly than what is created by a machine, but also when a machine corrects bias, it gets less credit than when a human does the same. And finally, we have the harm-wrongness plane. Of course, an action that is seen as more harmful is also seen as worse. But here we also see like a few different regimes. When the action is not very hurtful, we assign more wrongness to the machine than to the human. But when the action is seen as very harmful and involves a dilemma of fairness, like the ones that we have on the top, the human is judged more harshly than the machine. At that intermediate level, we have like two boxes there, in which actually the machine actions are seen, both more hurtful and worse than those of humans. So to conclude, I want to leave you with some sort of, take-home message. The first one is that eventually we could provide some sort of moral surface to start understanding very simply how this machine ethics works. And this is important because some people say that we don't need a machine ethics. We already have an ethics for humans, so we should apply that same ethics to machines. But that's sort of a theoretical argument. Empirically, we're starting to see that actually we judge machines differently, so we should try to understand really how these two planes work. So we can model these functions. We can model how wrong an action is as a function of harm and intention and interaction terms and even the characteristics of the subjects. And what we find is that they define different moral planes. The moral plane that assigns a moral judgment to a human action is different than the one that we use to assign moral judgment to machines. So this is the beginning of a very, very, very simplified theory of how moral actions occur in the context of humans and machines. So the takeaways are the following. In scenarios involving physical harm, what we've learned is that humans tend to judge machines more harshly than they judge humans. In scenarios involving fairness or loyalty, humans judge humans more harshly than they judge machines. In scenarios involving uncertainty, like in the tsunami example, the self-driving car, humans also judge machines more harshly, and they see them as doing actions that are more hurtful. And in scenarios involving automation, responsibility moves up the command chain. So if you're thinking about adopting AI in your organization, you also have to consider that this is going to centralize some of the responsibility of the actions that that AI is going to perform. These and other findings are going to be published next year in a book that we're working on with a number of colleagues. They include roboticists and social psychologists that we started to work, and summarize all of these scenarios. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Hi. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about your methodology and the sample you used in your research.
Yeah. So that's a good technical question. So the results that you see here, they only apply to the US population because we use a sample of a little bit over 4,000 people in the United States. One of the things that we're interested in is to try to understand how these vary by culture. For example, we believe that probably people in China might be much more technophiliac than in the US, which might be a little bit more technophobic. So the sample is only within the US. It was collected via Mechanical Turk. That's the basics details. Yeah.
Thank you.
So I want to ask you about company founders. Some CEOs say that everything that happens in their company is their fault because they hired everybody who works at their company. Do we have a bias against decentralizing responsibility?
I think the opposite. I think even though a CEO might say that, I don't know if they walk that walk. If someone makes a mistake, do they fire themselves or do they fire that person? So I do think it might be more of a rhetoric exercise. I do work a lot with large organizations, and I do see that people do delegate as a way to shield themselves from responsibility. Very frequently, you see it also in the context of the government. It's very easy to take credit for the good actions of those that are below you and to fire them in case that they make a mistake. Yeah.
Right, thank you.
Thank you.
So, hello. So as we can see from your research, in situations where there's harm involved, humans tend to judge more harshly machines than humans. So do you think this is the trend because humans believe that other humans are intentionally good and they cannot believe the same about robots?
So I think there's two parts to that question. One is I think there is a small effect, and here I'm hypothesizing because we haven't tested this fully, there is kind of like an insult to injury type of component. So in some sense, if you're killed by a police officer and you're killed by a machine, like I do think people see, something as more almost like an insult, to have been killed by a machine. It's very dehumanized. In the context of another human, might not be the case. In the context that there's risk involved, I do think that here there is a more complex mechanism. So two important concepts in ethics are moral status and moral agency. Moral agent is the one that makes an ethical decision. Moral status is recognizing that I cannot use you as a mean towards a goal. So in the case of the tsunami scenario, what I think is happening is that when people see the politician taking a risk, they see someone taking a risk because that person would be acknowledging the moral status of everyone else, and is basically making a risky decision because it has a heart. When they see the machine making the same risk, they don't think that the machine is doing that because it has a heart and is acknowledging the moral status of those citizens. So when the machine fails, it's not because it had a heart, it's because it didn't have a proper brain.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hey, I think it becomes more and more important to regulate AI. What are your thoughts on this? And more important, what are the questions that needs to be put when talking about regulating AI?
So I do think that we're going to regulate AI and technology in different ways, but I think we should not rush to it. I think we understand very little. If you think about it, the study that I just presented is one of the first ones that is actually looking at how even we judge humans and machines and whether we're doing it fairly. Like trying to do regulation nowadays with the level of understanding that we have is probably going to buy some path dependency of some bad regulations that is going to be hard to overcome in the future. I do think that we need to learn and understand things better before we jump into the regulation bandwagon.
So machines to a large degree are programmed by humans. So to what degree are humans responsible for machines?
So as we saw in the example involving the ads, responsibility moves up the command chain. So the people that would program these machines, of course, get responsibility. But we have to understand that AI is not hard-coded programming or algorithms. Like a lot of the outcomes of the AI don't come from the programming, come from the data. And in some sense, deep learning is this merge between like big data and algorithms in which the outcomes is not the results of one or the other. So the question is, well, if you're a programmer and program the machine, and you did a good job, but the data that someone gave you, had biases that eventually got expressed, in some sort of ways in your algorithm. Is it your fault? Is it the fault of the data collection? You do have, I think, a more complex landscape than just the people that are programming the machine, because a lot of what these algorithms are just doing is trying to mimic data. So a lot of the problems are going to always come from the training data more than the algorithm.
Thank you.
Although there's a lot of work that has been done in this research, it seems like it's only the tip of an iceberg, and it's not even clear what we are going to get from all this. Do you think there's something else similar to this that humanity has faced in the past and had to deal with, or is it something completely new for us?
There are clearly points in the past in which we had similar technological revolutions that had involved important, moral dilemmas. For instance, more than 500 years ago, when printing was being rolled out, it was considered demonic by the priests in Paris. Of course, the priests in Paris had kind of like a scribal business, so the printing machine was directly competing with their stuff, and it was also seen as, morally wrong. You had the Luddites, fighting against, the automation of textiles. And also printing, when it was introduced in the Islamic world, was first also forbidden, and you couldn't have printing because there was a belief that you should remember the Quran like by heart. You should actually be able to recite it and remember it. So it was also rejected on moral grounds. So I do think that people do tend to moralize about technology. In this case, we do have a technological revolution that is going to bring AI agents, which is different than just having machines. But I do think that we have to look at the past and look at the lessons as far as the printing press goes or other technological revolutions, and see and learn from those lessons, because probably we're going to have similar groups of polarized people arguing relatively similar positions, and there might be lessons about how we solved those problems in the past. Thank you.
Okay, so people tend to be skeptical about new tech at first. So my question is, what do you expect as machines and decision-making algorithms become a more important part of our lives, do you expect a radical shift in the way we judge them?
It's hard because there was already one AI winter. So, like, if you go back to the 50s when AI first, comes into the scene, there was a lot of enthusiasm about AI in the 50s and 60s until eventually the press and the media becomes very critical of AI to the point in which then during that first AI winter from late 70s, 80s, and early 90s, it was very hard to get even funding to do AI work because it was seen as extremely negative. Now we're seeing kind of like something similar, but I think the opinions and the situation is quite polarized. There's some people that are very critical. They want to regulate AI right away. They want to kind of like impose regulations, but at the same time, they might be failing to understand that there's a lot of potential positive uses that they might be impeding with that type of behavior. And there's other people that are, of course, very enthusiastic. I don't know, who's going to win the public opinion this time around, or whether we're going to go through a succession of cycles of technophilia and technophobia. Yeah.
Hi. I was wondering what you think would be the future of these moral dilemmas, given the convergence between the human and the machine. Sometimes people don't even know if it's the human or if it's the machine making these decisions.
So I presented this a few times, and one of the things that I think it's in the near future of this is to really go deeper into more industry-specific effects. So for instance, people in the healthcare sector are doing a lot of work on automation. There's a lot of work now on using computer vision to diagnose different types of cancers and early cancer and so forth. And the people that are working on this, they're finding that people are not very tolerant of machine mistakes, even when machines are much more accurate than the doctors themselves. So I do think that going deeper into these specific industries and these specific applications is going to be one of the places where this literature, should go. Thank you.
And our last question.
Hi, in your very first example, you mentioned fear. A police officer or a robot being afraid of the suspect doing something rash. Yeah. Isn't the whole idea about using robots instead of humans kind of about removing the factor of emotions of something like fear? Like, why should a robot be afraid of a suspect?
Yeah, so I agree with you, and in some sense, it's hard sometimes to create scenarios that are credible for both a machine and for a human. In that case, the idea that the machine feels threatened, it's a little bit, of a stretch. At the same time, you could think that kind of like machines in the future that are programmed to do, police enforcement work might have like some sort of like self-defense type of, triggers that they might employ. So even though it might not be caused by a feeling, it might be caused by something that sort of emulates the similar behavioral response, not caused by an emotional type of judgment, but caused by some other algorithm that results in the same behavior. Yeah. Right. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Cesar. We really appreciate it. A round of applause. Cesar A. Hidalgo.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.